This conference will now be recorded.
It is now 12:31, and I'm going to call for to order. And would you, EJ, to do a roll call to check for quorum for the record?
Yeah. Yes, President Williams, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, calling a roll call. Do we have Director Scott Houston?
Yes.
Director Don Deere?
Here.
Director Desi Alvarez?
Here.
Director Gloria Gray?
Here.
And President Harold Williams?
Here. So we have a full board here. So we'll start with our public comment.
President Williams, we do not have any public comments submitted through our system.
Okay, then we'll move right on into item 4, discussion items. And EJ, would you do us the honor, and I'll give control of this portion to you so that you can introduce item A and B. Thank you.
No problem, and thank you, President Williams. Obviously, Metropolitan Water District has one of the greatest staffs of all time, and that includes a number of excellent presenters and speakers. We're lucky enough to have 2 of them here today. The first presentation will be on California's water supply conditions, and this will be provided by Group Manager for Water Resources and Management, Mr. Brad Coffey.
Thank you, EJ and President Williams and Directors Alvarez, Deere, Houston, and Gray. It's my pleasure to be with you all today and to describe what our water conditions are and also a water supply condition alert that we'll be bringing before our board next week. So next slide, please. So as many of you all are aware, California and much of the West is in the 2nd year of a severe drought. One of the things that's most unique about this year is that though snowpacks were relatively robust, runoff has really dwindled. In fact, in the California Sierras, though there was something like 70% snowpack at the beginning of April, by the middle of May, there was only 2% snowpack. And much of this has not flowed to the reservoirs as it would have in other years that might be following average or wet years. Next slide, please. So these consecutive dry years are taking a severe toll on the imported water supply systems. The State Water Project allocation, which was initially set at 10% of our contracted amount, is now at 5%, and each 5% increment is roughly 100,000 acre-feet of water supply. So roughly 100,000 acre-feet of State Water Project allocation is available to Metropolitan this year. The Colorado River Basin is in an extended drought, really about its 21st dry year, although there's been some wet years interspersed there. And Bill, following me, will be talking more about the Colorado. So these are between the 2nd and the 4th lowest projected runoff for these systems in the recorded history that we have since the reservoirs were constructed, and even before so on the State Water Project. Next slide, please. So just a couple of pictures and what this means in Lake Oroville. Lake Oroville has dropped, storage has dropped to its lowest level since Oroville was constructed and began filling. You see an April picture, which looks pretty stark, and a July, which looks even starker at a common angle for a photograph of Lake Oroville. In fact, the water levels have dropped to a point where they've needed to remove the Hyatt power plant, which is basically embedded within the dam or below the dam at Oroville, offline, since the amount of water that could flow to those hydro units can't reach them, as the intake is on those kind of screens at the right. It's not a intake to the power plant that's extremely deep within the lake, so they've had to remove that power plant from production. Next slide, please. Lake Mead also is continuing to drop to historical levels, and we're expecting a very low level by the end of the year, and we're also expecting that the first ever shortage condition will be declared in basically next week by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Again, Bill will talk more on the Colorado. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. So different areas of the state have been affected more severely than Southern California. And currently, the governor has taken a measured and sequential approach to actions during this drought by declaring different drought emergencies. He's had 3 emergencies so far, and you see the different colors in the California map in the inset to the right, which shows that now there are 50 of 58 counties that are included within the governor's drought emergency. Now, 6 of those 8 counties that are excluded are within metropolitan service area. Also, the county of San Francisco and Imperial County are also not within the emergency declaration. And the State Water Board is also taking significant actions to preserve storage in Shasta and Lake Oroville to protect the delta from saltwater intrusion and to protect a cold water pool for fisheries. This has included a temporary urgency change petition. And in essence, it was an approved order to change the rules of the game a little bit. For example, moving upstream where the salinity monitoring points would be, or the salinity control points, installing the same salinity barrier that they installed in the Western Delta from the last drought, and making notices and beginning to curtail water rights holders, both pre and post 1914 water rights holders in the Delta watershed. And finally, also on July 8th, the governor issued an executive order calling for all Californians, both urban and agricultural water use, to voluntarily reduce water use by 15% from the 2020 levels. Next slide, please. So we believe that the governor's call for a voluntary reduction is an opportunity to show that Southern California is part of the solution. Now, Southern California has dramatically reduced its water use, particularly its per capita water use, over the past 3 decades, and also since the last drought in the 2012 through 2016. And the governor's call for voluntary reductions, at least so far, has departed from a command and control or a one-size-fits-all solution. My view is that water system in Southern California is this complex adaptive system that responds much better to need than to mandate. And so by responding to this need, we are able to support the state and the state's administration by preserving regional storage and preventing perhaps the need for more stringent measures later. And that's kind of the beauty of taking this measured approach, is that the governor is able, and his administration is able to look at the conditions on the ground, has taken lessons learned from the last drought, and is applying them in this drought. But Southern California can, instead of only relying on our past investments in this current drought, we can be forward-looking in our actions to address the current drought, looking towards perhaps a dry 2022, and also helping the state as a whole. Next slide, please. Now, Metropolitan has been along with the governor, and in fact, even earlier, has been taking significant actions in response to the dry conditions. For example, Diamond Valley Lake, which had a storage of nearly 800,000 acre feet at the beginning of the year, began releases to areas that normally would have been served by the State Water Project. We've also have a quite adaptive distribution and conveyance system, and we've been minimizing the flow of State Water Project areas to areas that could more easily receive a blend of both of those waters. In March, we began a number of our pump back programs to be drawing storage out of the Central Valley. And those have been on since March and will continue to be on until we have persisted through the dry conditions and well into 2022. We're also able to increase our flow on the Colorado River Aqueduct, and in April, we began operating the Colorado River Aqueduct at an 8-pump flow for the first time since 2015. So at the 8-pump flow, water literally almost laps at the edges of the canal because it's much higher than its original design intent. And our continuous monitoring and chlorination and actions to control the aqueduct let us operate it at that high level. Now, periodically, we have to drop a pump if the levels increase a little bit, but our goal is to be running it at full speed until the supply conditions change. Now, our board also in April provided us authority to explore and to purchase water transfers. Now, the water transfers have subsequently been impacted by the severely dry conditions and by the state curtailing the more senior water rights holders, but we have been participating in that water market. Finally, we've been making a change where for the first time ever, we've partnered with Department of Water Resources to move previously stored water in Diamond Valley Lake and push it backwards through some State Water Project infrastructure to the Mills plant, where we're able to draw from Diamond Valley Lake for the entire Mills service area. So this is really a dramatic change in how we've operated our system since the Mills plant was constructed. Next slide, please. Now, within our service area, there's also agencies who have an ability to take either State Water Project supplies or Colorado River supplies. And in recognition of the drought and of the conditions facing us, our board approved a new operational shift cost offset program. Now, that's kind of a mouthful to say, and you might hear me abbreviate it as OSCOP. But basically what that does is it helps us remove a disincentive for agencies to use Colorado River water where they can compared to State Water Project supplies. So it really brings us all on the same page and working together to preserve State Water Project supplies. We also turned on and completed a rehabilitation of the Gregg Avenue pump station, which allows some Colorado River water to make it as far to the west as possible in the Cayugas and Las Virgenes service area. Now, that's about 50 cubic feet per second that pump station produces, which is about 3,000 acre feet per month or 35 to 40,000 acre feet per year. We've also, for example, we're very appreciative of how West Basin has been working with us to shift demands. And LA has been operating the OSCOP program in order to minimize the use of State Water Project. We're exploring every rock, every connection, every interconnection to see how we can maximize this performance and push Colorado River water to areas that we haven't seen it in many, many years. And finally, we are using a transfer mechanism to pull some supplies from the Arvin Edison storage program. It previously had been constrained by some water quality considerations there, and through an exchange, we're able to pull some water from that program. So this isn't the end of the story, but it's what we've done through August. And I hope that it gives you the sense that we've been very actively working on improving the water supply condition for Southern California. Next slide, please. Now, even with those actions, and because the supply is so relatively low, we're expecting to draft on our record levels of storage. Storage had been climbing or staying steady since the end of the last drought in 2016, but we're needing to draft about 600,000 or 700,000 acre feet from our total storage. I'm going to take you through like 3 different sequences. This is at the highest level, just total storage. The next slide, if you forward to that, will show a little bit more detail. So we're expecting our current year demand to be about 1.8 million acre feet. And this is showing where that water will be coming from. About 1 million acre feet will be coming from the operation of the Colorado. About 96,000, remember about 5% table A is roughly 100,000 acre feet. The 26,000 acre feet of transfers, and then drawing around 650,000 acre feet out of the storage account. And so that green bar at the top was that dip in the total storage that you saw in the previous graph. Next slide, please. Now, even within these accounts, there's some storage that's at more robust levels, other storage that's dropping. And I just want to let you know that we are actively working on our 2022 plan, because as you see in the inset in the upper left, the State Water Project storage has been dropping more rapidly than other storage accounts. So we're working diligently to ensure that the region is secure for 2022. Next slide, please. So given the supply conditions, given our use of storage, and given the statewide call for conservation, we're recommending, we'll be bringing before the board, this board letter's posted, a recommendation to move up 1 notch in our water supply condition framework. Next slide, please. So a little background about our water supply condition framework. Our board adopted it in 2008. To change between these condition levels requires a board resolution. And the real purpose is to communicate the urgency of the region's water supply situation. Next slide, please. So here it is kind of laid out in Technicolor. And the lowest condition for the water supply is our baseline. We are currently at condition 1, which is a water supply watch, and have been since the end of the last drought, just to emphasize the continued need to preserve water supplies and how conservation today puts water into storage for a dry year. Now we're looking at moving up 1 notch to a condition 2, which would be a regional call for conservation through either drought ordinances or other measures in order to mitigate the use of storage. Now this language in the water supply condition framework actually predates a major package of legislation that the state legislature passed in 2018, the Conservation as a California Way of Life. As part of that Conservation of the California Way of Life legislative package, when water utilities submitted their urban water management plans and had those adopted this year, they had to also submit what's called a water shortage contingency plan. So it's a adopted contingency plan where each urban water agency lists the type of actions that they would do for increasing levels of additional conservation that are needed. So really this call for drought ordinances, that's a little bit of the older language. And what we're really asking and we can see it on the next slide, please. what we're really going to be looking at, and what our resolution will do, is to urge agencies throughout Southern California, throughout metropolitan service area, to look at their past drought response and to open up a very newly adopted water shortage contingency plan to identify and implement the actions that are appropriate for their local conditions to help the consumers voluntarily save water. Metropolitan is there with you. We'll work with the member agencies to develop a unified regional message in order to not be confusing to the Southern California water users and ratepayers. And we're also actively pursuing state funding and other resources in order to accelerate any conservation and supply programs. Next slide, please. So moving to this water supply alert really facilitates our region's continued use of water efficiency. One way that I describe this is we're not doing something new or different, but it's really about speed and scale of what we've always done in order to participate in this statewide emergency. We'll be using our bewaterwise.com website for consumers to be able to access conservation programs, both from the residential side and the commercial side. And also at our board, you'll see some additional public messaging and describing how we'll be moving forward with an advertising campaign region-wide. And I believe that's my last slide, so I'd be happy to address any questions, or Chairman Williams, if it's your preference, Bill can present, and then both Bill and I can address questions after. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Brent. Let me see, directors, any questions?
President Williams, if I could ask just about on that last slide, a little bit about the residential programs.
Go ahead.
On the turf replacement program, is Metropolitan looking to add additional funding for that this fiscal year?
Sorry, I had muted myself. Our current rebate is at $2 per square foot, which is certainly helpful. Some agencies are beginning to add additional funds to that, and we're actively working with the state to describe how additional funding from state sources could very easily be added to our program. We have all the administration, all the mechanisms in order to distribute that. So we're working with the state to try to increase that per square foot rebate. But right now, we're at the $2 per square foot and advocating for the state's additional funding.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, Brent.
Thank you, President William.
Okay, Bill.
Thank you, President Williams, and thank you for that earlier introduction, Mr. Caldwell. Appreciate that. We find ourselves in a very interesting position here in August of 2021. Lake Oroville, Lake Powell, and Lake Mead, three key reservoirs in the Western United States, are all at their lowest level ever. And every day they're continuing to drop, and all three are setting new records, and we'll do that through the fall. Both the Colorado Watershed and the State Water Project are experiencing one of the driest years on record. However, our water supplies from the two systems are dramatically different. While the State Project has a 5% allocation, our Colorado River supply is filled to the brim. We're bringing in as much water as we possibly can, nearly 12 times as much water on the Colorado River as our State Project allocation from Northern California. And it's the Colorado River that has kept Southern California counties out of the drought emergency so far. So next slide. So a little bit about where we've been on the Colorado and where we're headed. I'm going to talk about some of the major agreements that we've, briefly, the major agreements that we've negotiated over the last 20 years. The upcoming negotiations that we're about to start, both new guidelines and some near-term drought response actions given the low reservoir conditions. And finally, a little bit about board direction and some of our next steps. Next slide. I have to admit that I love maps and I can't do a presentation without showing a map. But this map of the Colorado River Basin to me shows what big of an area is affected by the Colorado River. 7 states in the United States, 2 states in Mexico, 40 million people over an area 1,000 miles long and hundreds of miles wide. In fact, the actions that we do here in Southern California can affect a farmer on the South Platte River in Colorado near the Nebraska border. Or actions we take in Southern California affect the owner of a river raft company near Albuquerque, New Mexico. We're all connected to the river and all of our actions affect everybody else. Next slide. So the major agreements on the Colorado River started it started more than 2 decades ago. I'll highlight some of the big ones. Each of these agreements took years to negotiate, many rounds, difficult times, frustration, but they ended up with agreements that were so important to Southern California. The first one is the Quantification Settlement Agreement, which involved the California agencies and the Bureau of Reclamation. Actually, a series of agreements, I think 29 altogether, that did a lot of things. I'll just highlight a few of the important ones. The QSA established water budgets for IID and Coachella so that Metropolitan and San Diego County Water Authority could go out and do transfers and bring in extra water into our region. The QSA authored the IID San Diego transfer, as well as the canal lining projects. Originally, the canal lining projects were going to be a metropolitan project. In the negotiations in the QSA and some of the last minute arrangements made, the canal lining was transferred to San Diego County Water Authority. And so most of the canal lining water goes to San Diego County. Some of it goes to the San Luis Rey Indians. The QSA set aside legal disputes. And for us, which was important at the time, it was provide surplus to Metropolitan. However, what we didn't count on was a drought that effectively meant we got no surplus at all after the QSA was signed. Nonetheless, the QSA went forward. Next slide. And barely after the ink was dry, we started working with the other 6 states on interim guidelines that would affect the entire Colorado River Basin. Those guidelines were completed in 2007 and they were effective for 20 years, which at the time seemed like forever, 2026. And the 3 major provisions of those guidelines was establishing lower basin surplus and shortage triggers. Of course, the surplus never happened, and so far the shortage hasn't happened, but the shortage is applied to Arizona and Nevada only, as California has the highest priority. The guidelines also better coordinate the operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead to more evenly manage those 2 reservoirs in conjunction with each other. And most importantly to Metropolitan, it established the Intentionally Created Surplus Program, or the ICS program, where we could meet our goal of storing water in Lake Mead in wet years and recovering it in dry years to fill our aqueduct, as we're doing this year. Next slide. But Mexico was not at the negotiations in 2007. So shortly after those agreements were signed, we began discussions with Mexico, and a series of minutes were negotiated that brought Mexico in to be a full partner on the Colorado River. In 2007, they were still fighting the United States. They were fighting California over lining the All-American Canal. But Over this next decade, we were very productive in discussions with Mexico in a number of minutes. The key provisions of those minutes were Mexico also participates in surplus and shortages when the United States is in surplus or shortage. Mexico can store water in U.S. reservoirs like we can. The United States, and in particular Metropolitan, partnered with Mexico to conserve water in the country of Mexico to benefit both Metropolitan and Mexico. And finally, there was an environmental component where it was very important to Mexico to rewater part of the Colorado River Delta. And in 2014, when the last time we had a 5% allocation in California, we found enough water to restore the Colorado River Delta for a few months, connecting it to the ocean. And in fact, this year, there's another pulse flow going through the Colorado River, the dry Colorado River in Mexico. And it's a testament that we can find water for environmental purposes in the midst of severe drought conditions. Next slide. Finally, and most recently, in 2019, in recognition that the Colorado was more susceptible to climate change than we had previously thought, we developed the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan, which protected the elevations of Lake Mead. It established triggers for lower basin Lake Mead contributions. Now, contribution is sort of like a shortage, but when a contribution is made, that water stays in Lake Mead in each state's name and can be recovered if Lake Mead recovers. So Metropolitan, California, and Arizona and Nevada all agreed that under certain conditions, we would add water to Lake Mead and make these contributions. The plan also incentivized storage. It let Metropolitan and other states store more water than previously thought, and added the size of our storage account in Lake Mead. And most importantly for Metropolitan, it provided the flexibility for recovering that storage and implementing exchanges in all reservoir conditions, so that even next year, when there is a shortage declaration, we can still take our water out and fill the Colorado River Aqueduct. Next slide. But all of those agreements that have been so successful are about to end. All of those agreements, with the exception of the QSA that I mentioned, expire in 2025, right around the corner. Mexico's minutes also expire at that same time. So we have we're starting a process to complete new guidelines that will supersede all of those agreements, a huge set of agreements. And the task to complete those new guidelines, of course, it's led by the Department of Interior, which will do an EIS process and ultimately a record of decision. The record of decision needs to be completed no later than December of 2025. So that's 4.5 years, which will go by like that. We need companion minutes with Mexico at the same time, and we have to have those discussions and bring Mexico along. We need to develop the implementing agreements to make this package happen. And those implementing agreements will be signed by Metropolitan and the other Section 5 contractors in California. That would be IID, Coachella Valley Water District, PVID, and Metropolitan all need to assign the agreements. And those agreements will be the interstate agreements that say how the rules on the Colorado will work between the states, and also the intrastate agreements. How are we going to deal with IID and Coachella and share if there's any cutbacks or share storage within California? Another thing that we're going to need to do in this period is to increase our compliance under the Lower Colorado Multi-Species Conservation Plan. That plan was developed in 2005, which gave us environmental coverage for existing water and power operations and foreseeably future water transfers. All of the QSA transfers fit into this compliance. But now that we know that the river is dry, we're going to have to do more than we envisioned. We're going to have to go back and expand the compliance under the MSCP in the next 4.5 years. And finally, we think that we're going to need to end this all federal legislation to implement it because many states say that if California takes more than 4.4 million acre feet in a shortage year, like we're going to do next year, perhaps, only the federal government, only Congress can authorize that. So we're likely going to need some kind of federal legislation. Next slide. And so while we're looking at the future of these guidelines, 4.5 years, current conditions as we started this conversation are not looking very good. The first 10 years of the decade were the driest 10 years in the history of the Colorado River. Then we had a wet year in 2011. We thought things were improving, and they were. But we went right back to dry conditions, and now the last 10 years from 2012 to 2021 are the new gold medal, the new driest 10-year period in recorded history on the Colorado River. Next slide. And as a result, we've seen Lake Mead drop significantly. And the blue line, if you can see it, it's not that bright, but we're down below that shortage tier. And the projected line is even with average rainfall and snowfall going forward, Lake Mead is going to drop another 20 to 30 feet over the next 2 years and come very close to that trigger for California making a DCP contribution. That's down around 7.3 million acre feet. Right now, we're about 9 million acre feet in Lake Mead, which is about 1/3 full. Next slide. So as Brad alluded to, on Monday, I won't even say anticipate, we know that the Department of Interior is going to make a first ever shortage declaration. And to me, the shortage declaration is there is a little sweetness in it. Not that a shortage declaration is good news, but I think the good news is that we've managed 14 years before we got to a shortage declaration. If you had said in 2007, we're not going to have our first shortage until August of 2021, we would have been really happy, especially given we've had the driest 10 years on record. But it's really highlights the collaboration that we've done to add water to Lake Mead and store water in Mead to keep us out of shortage, so that it took all this time before we have our first ever declaration next Monday. Now, what happens in a shortage? Well, Arizona and Nevada take the cut, 330,000 acre feet to those two states, mostly Arizona, a little bit Nevada. That's on top of the DCP contributions that are also required under the 2019 plan. So the total cutback to Arizona and Nevada next year will be 530,000 acre feet. Mexico also has to reduce its supplies because it takes shortage when the United States does. Their shortage is 50,000 acre feet on top of 30,000 acre feet of contributions under their version of the DCP. So that's 80,000 for Mexico. So the total lower basin reduction next year because of the shortage declaration is 610,000 acre feet. Pretty significant reduction next year for those three agencies. And of course, California is not taking a shortage. And even more than that, we can recover our ICS. And I think that is another testament of there's this shortage declaration that's going to have big cutbacks to 3 states, and California is still allowed to take more than 4.4 million acre feet if we have another dry year on the State Water Project. That's really a testament of the partnerships that we have made and the messaging we have done, that we can actually do that while everyone else is being cut back. Next slide. But that doesn't mean that we're completely out of the woods, because there's another determination that we anticipate will come in the very near future. This is a long paragraph taken from the DCP, and I'll read it and then explain what it means. But it says in the DCP that if any 24-month study by the Bureau of Reclamation projects that Lake Mead will reach 1,030 feet within the next 2 years, the Secretary and the lower division states shall consult and determine what additional measures will be taken by the Secretary and the states to avoid and protect against the potential for Lake Mead to decline to elevation 1020. We anticipate that this trigger will be met in the next few months, possibly even next week in their updated study. And that means that we're going to have to start some discussions early about how we're going to live with a reduced flows, not just post 2026, but even in the next few years. So the negotiations the tough negotiations might be sooner than even that 4.5-year time frame. Next slide. So we already are getting out ahead of the drought, the shortage declaration, and responding to drought conditions. If you recall, in June, our board approved an agreement, which was July approved by Southern Nevada Water Authority and August approved by Central Arizona Project, and anticipated to be signed by the Bureau of Reclamation this week, which is a system conservation agreement with Palo Verde Irrigation District. And because our own ICS is in such good shape and our supplies on the Colorado are good, we lowered our fallowing call at PVID down to the minimum amount starting August 1, which left space for additional fallowing to benefit the Colorado River system. And that's exactly what this agreement does. Reclamation is paying 50%. CAP, Southern Nevada, and MET are paying 1/6 each to increase fallowing in PVID by 60,000 acre-feet a year. In addition to that's 60,000 above our existing call. It's a 3-year program. This first year is voluntary, so we might not get 60 this first year, but certainly the next 2 years we'll get 60,000 each year, which will add about 3 feet of water to Lake Mead over the next 3 years. Not a drought buster, but certainly it's going to help slow the decline of Lake Mead, and it's an example of what can be done. Our board also approved a similar agreement can be done with Bard Water District, and those same agencies are seeing if they can expand this PVID program with Bard. So this is an example of something that can be done quickly in response to low reservoir conditions. Next slide, which is my last slide. So what are our next steps? Well, first that we're going to do as we're going into these upcoming discussions is get our board input to update our Colorado River policies. Our existing policies have served us very well. They were to develop programs for California to live within its 4.4 million acre-foot apportionment, develop a program to get environmental compliance for our activities, and to develop programs to fill our aqueduct in dry years. Going forward, we're going to need some new policies that could include things like, is California willing to take a shortage on the Colorado River, and under what conditions? And what do we want in exchange for doing that? Another policy could be, do we want to allow other states to fund programs, to partner with programs such as the Regional Recycling Project and share in the benefits or share in the yield of those programs? That's another policy our board will want to consider. Another one could be within California. What's our policy on buying land, agricultural land along the Colorado River? So we're going to have our board have some high-level policy that will guide us in these negotiations. We're also going to develop a short-term action list like this PVID program to see what can we do in short notice to respond in case next year's dry, which we certainly are hoping it's not going to be, but we're going to be prepared in case it is. At the same time, we're going to look ahead and evaluate what is the long-term supply gap and the total reductions needed over the next 10, 20, 30 years. Estimates range from 1 million to perhaps 2 million acre-feet from a lower basin total reduction. But we have to get better understanding our future risks. And then finally, develop a plan consistent with our board principles that eventually we'll take to our board for approval, certainly no later than December 2025, and perhaps earlier as we go along the way. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks for your time this afternoon.
Okay, well, thank you, Bill. How about questions? Board? I see a hand up. Who's that? Speak. Whose hand is that?
This is Russ Lefebvre. I've got my hand up. Am I the one?
Yeah, you're the one. Go ahead, Russ.
Bill, who has to be, who are the stakeholders? I mean, it's Reclamation in Mexico and the 7 states. Who else has to sort of, I guess, has to sign on to the agreements?
So there's 2 processes. There's the EIS process, which is very public, and a broad range of stakeholders will provide input. They'll provide public comment. They will try to influence reclamation for their own goals. Ultimately, for the final plan to be approved, it's the Section 5 contractors in California and the state representatives in the other states have to sign on to the plan ultimately for it to happen.
Okay, so the ultimate plan is you have to get the states and I guess Reclamation in Mexico, right?
Yes, so the International Boundary and Water Commission will oversee the minutes with Mexico, but we will be meeting with Mexico and having a parallel process. So it won't be part of the NEPA process. It'll be a separate process, but it will be closely coordinated.
Okay.
There will be other outreach to the Native American tribes, to the NGO community, to other groups as the process goes along. But ultimately, it's up to, within California, those 3 ag agencies and Metropolitan to approve the deal.
Sounds pretty complicated. How much water can we get from BARD if we get the same kind of deal with PBID?
Well, currently our BARD program is about 6,000 acre feet, so it's not huge compared to PBID, but
yeah.
There's the potential to expand it, and there's also the potential for the Quechan tribe, which is part of BARD, to participate, and they have more eligible type crops. So between the 2 of them, you might get 20,000 acre feet.
Well, that's not trivial, but okay, thanks.
Okay, anyone else?
President Williams, this is EJ. I do have a question.
Yes, EJ, go ahead.
Bill, in one of your previous slides, you talk a little bit about the interim guidelines terminating in 2025 and the potential need for federal legislation. Given the state of Congress and the difficulty in moving legislation through, what's your timing on that as far as introduction and kind of how you're going to work this issue? I know that sometimes Congress deals, I guess, fairly well with specific deadlines, and looking at a termination date that might help. But how are you going to time that?
Well, that's something that we certainly will need to figure out as we move along, because we're not even sure of our own timing. But we have a history of working well with Congress. When you get 7 states, 14 senators on the same page, usually things go a lot smoother. The drought contingency plan legislation went through pretty quickly and pretty smoothly. So while that's always a question mark dealing with Congress, I think our history shows that we've got, it's such a bipartisan collaboration that it tends to be easier than other things. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
Any more? Well, that concludes things. Thank you very much, Brad and Bill. Thank you for taking your time to come and present to us. I just want to say briefly that a couple years ago, maybe 4 or 5, we were talking to our constituents about what you presented today. And back then they said, that sounds pretty scary. And so it seems scary when you look at the graphs that you showed at the beginning of your presentation, and Oroville looked pretty bad. I mean, that is scary. When we were used to seeing Oroville was the place to go, and we had water everywhere. So what can we do? How do we present what you presented today to our constituents? So not scare them to death, but get them motivated to really want to help us conserve water. Hello?
Thank you, President Williams. I'll respond briefly to that, and then either Devin or Bill can certainly respond as well. I think there's a couple things. One is that, from my perspective, my job and our job as water professionals and water planners is to be able to divorce the notion of a single or 2 years of dry weather require our constituents, our customers, to do dramatic things. So we want to be able to invest in water supply reliability so that the maps that you show that we show of red don't mean immediate cutbacks for our consumers. So we want to really show value to the investments that we've made. Two, that we want to communicate in ways that are appropriate for each of our communities, because the water supply condition might be different. And three, that we want to take messages to communities and look for water savings in each community where appropriate. So in some communities, it might be appropriate to look at outdoor water use reduction. For others, it might be appropriate for programs that Metropolitan has, such as multifamily housing toilet rebates that generate third-party activity to replace toilets in older homes. So I think that each community is unique and where we want to find water savings opportunities. And our staff will be working with the PIOs in order to kind of craft appropriate messages for that.
Okay, thank you. Well, it sounds like West Basin is doing the right thing based on that, because I believe that EJ and his team are doing just that.
West Basin has always been a strong partner with Metropolitan Water District, and we're encouraged by the actions that you take.
Well, thank you very much. Any other comments? If not, we'll move to item number 5 on the agenda, EJ, and that says adjournment.
That's correct, President Williams.
So if that's the case, we are adjourned. Thank you.